very succinct bio. Thank you. I'm really excited to be with you guys today. It's been really fascinating watching some of the sessions earlier today, and to see where we are very aligned in our thinking, and then where we sometimes have difference of opinions. And so, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be one of the voices that you have curated for this extraordinary event. And as the previous speaker said, you know, we're in this moment that is both very poignant and very significant and scary for many people. And I think there's an incredible privilege right now that if you are not someone who's facing this illness or facing a huge financial fear, that we get to hold the space for what comes next. And that's the space from which I'm operating today, with just, again, a tremendous amount of reverence for the folks who are going through the really difficult moments, and for those who are responding on the front lines, and acknowledging, again, this amazing place that we get to have to talk about what comes next. And just to help clarify a little bit more about why I care about this, for some reason my slide, oh, there we go, okay. So just to give a little bit more perspective, I do a lot of global keynote speaking and talking a lot about the future and helping frame it for folks, but I also have a strategic consultancy called Play Big Inc. So there's sort of two websites that you can go to, in which we try and help organizations more effectively navigate their way through all these escalating expectations and big changes, and explain, again, what's happening and how to build the future, not just react to it. And then part of my work is that I work with an artificial intelligence company here in Austin, Texas, that builds very narrow, discrete apps for businesses. So we are really trying to be practical AI and not make it such a scary or, you know, overwhelming thing to become familiar with and start to see the advantages from your businesses. So, and there's a bunch of other initiatives that I have around those things, around building more confidence with youth and thinking about the very edge of the future and economic development. So all those things factor in when I start to answer questions about where we're going. And that seems to be the big question, right? Everyone always wants to have a sense of what is happening next and what is going to take place. And the reality is it's all happening so fast. And now it's being completely broken open, and completely new things can be created and discovered and experimented with. But we know what's interesting for most of the people that are going to be part of these 2 or 3 days is we've been advocating for these kinds of behaviors that we're seeing now for many years, right? We've been encouraging business leaders and government leaders to be experimenting with systems that are more adaptive, that are more inclusive, that are more sustainable, that are often more humane, and to prepare for a future that feels like the one that we're now heading into. So I think, if anything, all of this has now been accelerated. So as we give a lot of really tangible advice about how to move through it, the one that I think is most relevant is to take a deep breath. You know, as you move into a future that is so, again, constantly changing and requiring so much of us to learn and to think differently about, it does help just to remember to take a deep breath, to center oneself for this. There's a close friend of mine who describes that if you, take care of the center, you can handle the chaos and the change on the edge. And so for all those who've been listening for, hours, I definitely encourage you to take a deep breath. And I have a lot to go through, so it helps to also just prepare oneself for that. Because we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, the question is, how do you calibrate it? And I have a compass that just has these 2 questions. I've used it for years in all my strategic work. It seems to work pretty well for even the moment that we're in right now, which is to spend a little time thinking about what the future needs and expects of us, and then to think about what we're in a unique position to create and contribute to that. What's been fascinating to me to see over the last few weeks is how many business leaders have confessed that they were blindsided by this, that they feel like in hindsight they would have done things differently. Sometimes they apologize for it, sometimes they feel a little embarrassed about it, a little ashamed about it, but over and over again they feel like somehow they should have somehow future-proofed or accelerated some of these behaviors. And I think that this is a beautiful opportunity to shift from thinking about this from a hindsight perspective and really move into a foresight perspective, right? When you think about what the future needs and expects from you, you can build better decisions. You can think about this differently. And this is as an individual, this is as an organization, it's as an industry, I would argue even as a nation, as a planet. These questions are really valid to think through. So as I spent time thinking about this in the midst of all this, I did put together an essay a few weeks ago or I guess 2 or 3 weeks ago now, that was simply titled, What We'll Know and What We Won't Know by September. So if you look 6 months out, what are the things that we will know and what we won't know? And whether the world stops shaking or not, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen with this virus and exactly when things will resume in a way that feels more familiar than it does right now. So as I started to think through those things, there's a long list of them. And I love that Joshua asked a whole bunch of questions, because this really does raise so many questions that we don't always have the answer to. But I started to think about it, it does sort of coalesce into 4 themes, right? At first I called them shifts, and I'm realizing they're really awakenings. And they're not just 4, but let's start with these 4. And when I say awakenings, what I mean by that is that we will never be able to not know these things again. How we decide to activate or action those is up to each of us. But the fact is that we will all now know these things. And so the question is, where do we go from here? So this is just a quick talk to kind of go through those 4 at a very high level. You could dive into any one of these things with more detail and probably raise more questions than they answer. My goal is really to think about, to prepare us to think differently about the future. So it's not just about knowing these things, but then how do we approach it differently as a result of knowing this? So we'll just launch into it. I call it again the 4 pandemic awakenings that are shaping the new economy. And the first is this sudden and collective launch into a digital reliance for work, well-being, and social continuity. Again, we have been advocating that things about remote work or trying these new technologies or thinking about ways to be able to build, again, these more adaptive things. And what we were always told was that it was too difficult, it was too expensive, it was too disruptive, it was too insecure, it was too impersonal. Like nobody would have imagined that these things would actually really work. And the fact is that now we have to do it. Like this is survival, right? Remote school, telemedicine, potentially e-voting, all these collaborative things that we are now learning to do with these technologies. And as we're doing it, we're all doing it at the same time, which means that we're learning together and we can share vulnerabilities and we can share stories around them. We can share best practices. We can not be all ashamed about having to ask questions or learn from one another. So it's really a unique thing that this is happening en masse, as opposed to slowly rolling out over the course of 5 or 10 years. So there's something really profound that is happening as we now take in this whole new world and dive in together. Some of the examples of it are that you see in New York City, the teachers had this Herculean task of moving 1.1 million children to online education in just a very, very short time, like a couple of weeks, right? If you had seen that headline a year ago, you would have not believed it. And 75% of those kids, I think, are on reduced lunches, which means that they come from lower income families that don't have all the technology at home to make that an easy thing to do. And the teachers are often living in smaller homes and apartments that are trying to figure out how to make this work. So the question is, again, what I think is stunning is that this was possible. There are some learnings around it, some technology changes that are happening, but the fact is that people are diving in and they're learning. And in parting in the learning, you're seeing what works and what doesn't work. So a whole bunch of innovation will come out of that understanding. What's also been fun is to see the social behaviors that come out of this. So this is one of my favorite person to follow on Twitter. Aileen Lee has a very creative husband who dresses every single day in a different costume when he goes to work on Zoom. So where he has his closet full, people are fascinated that he's able to come up with this every single day and can't figure out how he stores it all. But I think it's just interesting, right, between the happy hours that we see and all the other ways in which we're connecting almost more personally with one another as we see each other's homes and children and we check in with each other. These technologies have not actually pulled us apart. In some ways, they've pulled us even closer together and more humanistically together, which I think is fascinating. So this bodes for me the question, which is when all of these other technologies start to emerge and converge in a more dramatic way than they currently have, what will the future look like? And will we be ready for that? We've been researching a book and talking to a lot of technologists. I work with technologists all day long. And when you ask people where we are, they mostly believe they're about 1% in to this new digital world that we're heading into, this new economy, this new post, whatever you want to call the 4th productive revolution. And so you start to say, okay, well, it's not just by getting used to the current tools, but it's about being able to prepare ourselves now better for the things that are coming down the pike. So for example, this question about drones. I think in earlier speakers a lot, we had this question about whether or not people will use drones more or not. There are drones already that are delivering both in the United States and in Australia, and I think there's also a test in Finland with Wing, which is a division of Alphabet, and they are seeing dramatic increase in drone delivery, as would be expected, right? What's fascinating is that people are asking for toilet paper and baby food and pastries, apparently pasta. But the fact is we will see this. You'll see robotics more in many ways. You'll see autonomous delivery of things. You will see, again, an appreciation for why those technologies are so important, and I think a faster adoption of them as people start to see the value that it creates. Would we also be ready for a company in which we do all of our work in VR? So not just working from home and using cameras like this, but putting ourselves in an immersive environment. There's a real estate company that's already a $1 billion real estate company that is using VR exclusively for their agents all over the world. So again, new technology. We're just trying to figure out Zoom versus Google Hangouts versus, GoToWebinar versus Microsoft Teams. And here will be another wave of technology that helps us figure out how to connect and collaborate in more immersive ways. And then we start talking about telemedicine. I have done a lot of work in the healthcare world with folks who don't believe that AI will necessarily have such a huge impact on our future. And I will say, well, right now we're seeing telemedicine, right? The next wave of that would be that would you be diagnosed by an augmented technology, which has doctors and AI work together. And this is an example from China in which there's a sort of kiosk, sort of photo booth looking machine in which you go in and you're assessed by AI. And then given a prescription directly from that kiosk that somehow cryptographically unlocks it for you. So that seemed outrageous, again, just a few months ago, and now seems to me much more plausible. You start to imagine how you make healthcare accessible and tech-enabled across a wider geography. And then lastly, I think that there's new innovations that are coming out of this, right? So Trace Together is an app that was out of the Singapore government. We've seen many of them across the world with different features and built each a bit differently, but there's really this interesting question about how will we use technology to keep us safe and how much privacy we're willing to give up for that, or do we have to give up privacy for that? Are there ways of building this in a way that keeps us more secure, both health-wise and privacy and data-wise? And just imagining all the data that's now being created as a result of these new online behaviors. And that's a whole another thing that we'll be able to assess and work through. So I just think that we're in this extraordinary moment right now where, again, all together as a planet, we have jumped into this and experienced both the surprising benefits of it, and I'm sure some of the pain points around it, and figuring out ways to manage it. I think a lot about if this had happened 20 years ago, where we didn't have these kinds of tools, we didn't have the cloud to be able to download and upload our files, to be able to update our software, we didn't have all these social technologies with which we were able to connect. So then I advance and say, well, where would we be 20 years from now? And we look back on this day and think, wow, what did we know and what didn't we that made this work smoothly, and how will we do it differently in the future? That's number one. Deep breath. This, of course, though, brings up the second very, very important one, which is that we're also now really aware and have compassion for the current economic and societal inequities, right? Not everyone has internet access. Not everyone has the hardware and software that we need to be able to do this. Not everyone can work remotely from home. Not everyone has a safety net financially. Not everyone has medical care accessible to them in an easy way. So that, whether that's in the United States or whether that's around the world, we're certainly see that playing out in huge, huge form right now. And it's been interesting to see the reactions to that. I'm so heartened by the compassion that comes with it. So we're seeing things like, longest food lines at food banks than they've ever seen. We see millions upon millions upon millions signing up for unemployment benefits, or really being grateful for the government relief programs that are coming across the board for small businesses, for existing businesses, for individuals. So there's been, again, this phenomenal response that has come through, which is very, again, encouraging as you start to imagine how compassionate we can be when we pay attention. The question will be, as we move forward, what are we seeing, right? We're seeing imbalances in how this is playing out across various communities. And we're also seeing that the potential for this to widen the inequality. So while there's a compassionate response, unless we go and address it systemically, this could actually widen it, as people who were vulnerable before become even more on the edge and having to sort of climb out of it. And those who have a lot of resources that are able to scoop up and take over even more, significant parts of our economy. So I think that's a really key part to continue to look out for. So then as I think about, okay, well, what happens next? What's on the corner? What's an opportunity available to us in this? I start to imagine that we will be able, that we have within us to build more affordable, more accessible, more inclusive communities. Cities and various technologies will allow us to be able to ensure that people are not so left out of this digital future. I think one of the actual upsides of this is to see that in many school districts, they are distributing technology to the kids who didn't have it in their homes, and they're helping their parents learn it and helping their parents coach the kids. And so suddenly maybe that might be lifting a portion of the divide, but I think there's a lot of work for us to still do to ensure that it doesn't continue to expand, and that we think about it again on a constant basis of how we do our work, that we now see this vulnerability, how do we address it? This whole conversation about universal basic income that years ago, we've been talking about this for 8 or 9 years in my world, and people thought was crazy, has now made it to such a big part of the conversation around the world. And I thought this headline was interesting. This came from the Harvard Political Review, which is an undergraduate magazine of Harvard University. So these are young people who are really looking at this now as almost a given as we look on to the future. But the question isn't just universal basic income and how that should be distributed, and if that is the right solution, what the right amount is, and whether these tests have been conclusive or not around the world that have tried this. But it also raises questions about things like universal basic transportation, universal basic healthcare, universal basic education, universal basic housing, which seems crazy, but when you can 3D print houses for a fraction of the cost, that might not be so crazy. So you start to think about how can we build more systemic and more inclusive solutions moving forward. The reason I think this is so important is not just for this moment right now, but we're going to be, facing similar questions when we talk about technological displacement. And again, earlier speakers have talked about the fact that there are two sides to that story. Some people believe we'll have more work. Some people believe we have less work. Regardless, everyone will need to be upskilled and reskilled and may not be able to do so in time. And so now that we're thinking about these people who are, again, who need more support, will that be creating some scaffolding for us moving forward and building different kinds of societal and economic solutions, which I think is encouraging. The third is that we also now get this incredibly clear view of our consumptive behavior on the planet, right? If I was answering some of Joshua's questions before, I would have never believed it was possible, even in the most crazy science fiction novel, that all planes are grounded, all cars are stopped, most manufacturing stops, all retail is closed. It is extraordinary to see when all of our consumptive behavior gets shut down, what that does for the environment. And we start to see things like, a huge drop in air pollution. You can see blue skies for the first time in Beijing. You can see the Himalayas in parts of India. You can see clear water running through the streets of Venice. These are all news updates that we've been getting from around the world about when we stop doing what it is that we're doing in our day-to-day lives, the impact that it has on the planet. So if I was going to imagine that in some ways the Earth is taking a really big, deep cleansing breath and having a chance to sort of heal a bit. We don't know if it's a little, we don't know if it's a lot. We don't know if that climate crisis deadline of 2029 that we've all heard about, which is sort of the turning point, will that be extended out? But there is this opportunity right now for us to see that our behavior has a certain impact on the planet. Now, again, there's this toss-up between economic viability and environmental health and well-being. So we have to strike a better balance. So the question becomes, again, coming out of this, will we make more responsible choices and trade-offs between these things? This was a credit card out of Sweden that Trend Watching shared last year with us that showed that there was a credit card that is tied to carbon footprint, meaning that you set a carbon goal each month. And once you've reached that goal for whatever it is that you've purchased, it stops working then as a credit card, right? And has a pledge on the back that reminds me that I'm taking responsibility for every transaction I make to help protect the planet. Again, this seemed kind of outrageous 6 months ago or a year ago. Maybe it's a little less outrageous now as we start to really see that this does have an impact. And what will be other solutions that people create that allow us to be able to create a better synergy between the actions that we take and the impact that it has on the planet. One of the most outrageous that I think, again, is encouraging is Air Nippon Airways out of Japan that envisions travel without any planes. Again, this is an airways company, right? The name of it. And they're thinking that they're not just in the airways company industry, they are actually in the travel or transport to new experiences industry. And they're thinking about ways in which they can use avatars and remote technologies and even haptics to help people experience things that they wouldn't be able to experience either because they couldn't afford it or they couldn't travel for whatever reason, or because we're overrunning certain parts of the planet with our desire to see Machu Picchu or to dive in vulnerable parts of the ocean. And so they're thinking about ways in which they can make that accessible to people through these technologies, which to me, again, is really encouraging and exciting and shows that you can still have a capitalist business in a society in which we might restrict certain behaviors because of an environmental sensitivity. And the fourth, and then I will start taking questions in a minute. Sorry, my computer's doing kind of odd things, so I can't see all your comments as I'm going through this, but I'll slow down in a minute and would love to have more of a conversation around this. Because the fourth is, I think, the crux of it, right? Is that in the middle of all this, we also have a much deeper understanding right now of ourselves and our capacities and our support networks. The real question coming out of this was, who will we trust? Where will we turn, right? And how are we showing up for each of these things? And so things that I've been watching is like how people talk about what it's like to work at home with their family or what it's like to work with their spouses. Funny things like where you learn that your quarantine partner is the kind of guy who says, "Let's circle back." And this woman laughed about that and got 666,000 sort of likes or commentary on it. Or really appreciation for each other, right? Here, my wife teach middle school, and the other room, I realized how amazing she is. So we're seeing again each other through these really different lenses, even in our own families. But it goes beyond that. It's not just about our immediate circle of community and support. It's also ourselves. Like we're seeing a rise in meditation apps and in people seeking out ways in which they can handle their anxiety or manage through some of the stress of this or the fear of this. We were already a very anxious world before this hit. And now I think it has certainly accelerated that for some. And then I think others are finding comfort in this new community or in this way of being able to do things really differently and potentially being able to slow down and recalibrate some of what we're doing and how we're doing it. We're also then looking into institutions. We're looking into corporations. Who is it that really has our back, right? Either as an employee or as a customer. So I think these are some extraordinary examples where you saw Microsoft pledge early on in the beginning of this that they would still pay hourly workers even if they weren't able to show up for work. These were cafeteria workers or janitorial staff or some of the support staff for the business. We saw the CEO of Marriott give a very impassioned talk to his community, which was both direct employees and customers. This is a man who is also fighting cancer at the same time. There was a question about whether or not he should show on camera his hair and his head looking as it is. And it was just such a beautiful and poignant talk. He called it right out. He started to tear up a little bit again. This is a person whose business has dropped 90% in the early weeks of this and is sort of thinking through how they manage through it. So they can't afford to keep paying everyone, but he still felt very empathetic around it. And then you see folks like Governor Cuomo, and I'm giving a shout out to my friend Jennifer Sertle, who is probably on the call right now or on this session, who is a really thoughtful, I would call it like societal philosopher. She's great to follow on all the social media. She posts amazing things. And I thought the way that she captured what Andrew Cuomo was doing with his press conferences, which were not just about the facts and not just about the government response, but also really tuning into who people are as humans, what it feels like to have cabin fever, how it is that we need to treat each other. He's really showing that leadership has a much broader perspective. And so we start to again think, who is it that we can trust? Another colleague, Josh Bernson from Deloitte, described it as we're moving into an era where the CEO is the chief empathy officer, which is, again, a big shift and an awakening that I am really excited to see. And I found this story just a few days ago in the Harvard Business Review, where they talked about building a resilience in the face of crisis. So it's not only, again, our support systems and our institutions, but it's also ourselves. And there's a beautiful little quote that they have in there about sort of a Buddhist story that describes the first arrow is the thing that creates a tremendous amount of pain. But the second arrow, if it hits the second one, is our response to that, because we're not so shocked by it anymore. So how is it that we build capacity and resilience to be able to handle the things that are happening around us? And I think they're going to be split between people who get much more insecure around this and other people who find this incredibly deep well of resilience, both within themselves and within their communities. We've been talking about loneliness for a long time. We've been talking about how community is the antidote to many mental health issues and certainly to loneliness. And we see this amazing flourishing of that around the world. As in Italy, right? They went out on their porches and they reached out to their neighbors. And at first it was just to sing together. It then morphed into also then providing support for first responders across the world. But I thought the first outbreak of this in Italy, where we got to see people sing from their porches, and maybe it happened in China as well and just wasn't shared as quickly, but is such a promising experience to see that when we really do pay attention to each other and we see who's out there, there are ways that we can connect even when we can't physically be near one another, but we want to be connected with one another, which is again, a really important thing. So as I think about the four awakenings, right, they each create an opportunity, right? The first is to realize again that if we are diving into this new technological world, we're only 1% in. Do not think that we are done, but to recognize that you can do it, right? We have learned that we can do it and there are tremendous benefits to doing it. And so what will these other things bring us that are also very beneficial? And what will they be where we need to watch out for some things that we want to make sure that we don't naively march into without thinking about the consequences? The second is that we will be building a more inclusive society, is my hope, right? Again, it could go the other direction if we aren't really thoughtful about it and don't pay attention to it. But my hope is that we're building more inclusive systems and opportunities for all to participate in this future we're heading into. The third is that there's a better balance between economic and environmental viability, right? It should not, the hope is that the trade-off is not as dramatic as it currently is. And then the fourth is that we again recognize our own resilience, the resilience of our support systems, and we really start to build more of an outreach in terms of how we hold one another. One of the things I always talk about is that we deserve to be well held by each other, by the systems we design, and by the technologies that we advance. And here's an opportunity to really put that into action and continue it. This isn't just in a moment of time, but how do we continue these behaviors moving forward? The last thing I'll say, the reason this is important for business and the way I talk about it from the new economy is before the pandemic even started, there was this split that was happening between organizations that understood these trends and these shifts and these new ways of approaching and behaving versus the ones that didn't, right? So even before this, 1 out of 3 companies would cease to exist in their current form for the next 5 years, 6 times the rate from 40 years ago. And that the gap between those who understood it and those who didn't was continuing to grow as profitability spread between the top and bottom quartiles of the companies, and that spread has doubled in the last 30 years. So this is, again, just for me, a giant wake-up call for companies to really pay attention to what is happening and not assume that we're just trying to get through a moment and then we're going to snap back, but there's actually a new doorway that we're walking through that gives us tremendous more opportunity to build things in a much more solid, again, humane, adaptive, sustainable way. So we'll breathe deeply again, and I will try and figure out where these questions are that are coming through. Thank you guys for your patience as I just sort of barreled through that. But so someone's asking, I wonder if the educational inequalities like a broadband tech deserts will become more significant for federal government and corporations. I'm not sure I fully understand that question, but I think that it is, again, I think that we now that we see it, we have to figure out some way to manage it. And if we don't, then there will be more and more riots around it. I think it will actually become a violent situation. I don't mean necessarily with pitchforks and weapons, but I do think you're going to see more rent strikes. You're going to see more people feeling left out of the system if we don't figure out a way to take care of people now. Would you recommend studies that could be undertaken to help small island developing states prepare for coming technological displacements? Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really, really big question, right? How are we going to manage technological displacement? I don't know that I have the answer. I do think, at one point, Jenny Romedy from IBM talked about a question about how many people will need to be reskilled. And her answer was 100% will need to be reskilled. And I agree with her. So the question is, how do we start to build capacity for that so that people are able to, and I hope that actually in this moment, we're recognizing that online learning works, that there'll be more people who are curious and take that step or more supported to take that step. There was a statistic out of Harvard that I found really startling last year, and we've been trying to find the source of it, so I haven't been able to actually attribute it, but it was work I think that was done out of their Future of Work group that said that they predicted as many as 38% or much as 38% of the population may not be able to be reskilled. That's dramatic. I mean, even if you're off by 10%, right? Even if a quarter of the population isn't able to be reskilled in time, what does that mean? And so the question is it always the responsibility of the person, or is it also the system of which we are a part, and how do we build better scaffolding, which is why questions like universal basic income or universal basic other services become more viable as solutions and scaffolding to the next economy. I do believe at some point everyone will have a piece in it, just as we have through all the other revolutions, but the torque on this one is really fast. And I think we need to do a better job of it, recognizing that and helping people through it. You're outlining a positive path toward positive recalibration of how we will live together as communities, but how we'll be able to overcome the profound resistance and the entrenched 1%. Yeah, I mean, I do think that is, I guess my belief is that is a paradigm that is outliving its usefulness and at some point will crumble. I don't know exactly how that's going to happen. Many people are building solutions that will be able to go around some of these systems and tunnel sort of underneath it, as opposed to trying to shift what is currently there. I think that as we start to see on the horizon what will be possible when we've got a distributed web and we're able to coordinate resources differently and think about how we connect with one another and create value and attribute value, some of that stuff will start to change. And one of the projects I'm working on is with economist and author and this amazing thinker, Rian Eisler, who's been advocating for decades that GDP is an outdated metric. And it's really a measure of a very specific thing that was a 20th century component of the economy, which is about industrial production and consumption. And that if we're moving into the 21st, we need to have a much more inclusive measure. So we're right now working on developing that, currently described as the social wealth index, that when you start to look at things more broadly, it starts to shift the power structure from that perspective, meaning that you're attributing value to a lot of things that currently right now are invisible, like the $10.9 trillion worth of production that is created by people who are unpaid, majority of which are women, right, in caring services or in volunteer and other places. So when you start to account for things differently, that math of the 1% potentially holds differently. Hopefully that makes sense. How about international cooperation in the future? Where does the crisis show? That's actually a really interesting question, because I think that on the one hand, we've always talked about that. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question correctly, but the way I've been thinking a lot about this is that we talk a lot about that we're so globally interdependent. And if anything, this has made us even more aware of how connected we are to one another and how hard it is to kind of contain something, even if we really try hard and want to. So the reality is, will we move forward in a more collaborative way to start building some of these solutions together, or will we actually retrench and become even more nationalistic and more protectionist? And I think that that will happen. You're going to see people advocating for both of those points of view. And again, the question will be, what do we think is the safest and strongest way through? I think the same thing you're going to also see, just as an aside, individuals not deciding necessarily always to go into urban areas. I think you're going to see people want to spread out more and have kind of their own space and figure out a way, again, in which these technologies can allow us to live even further away from the center of things. So it'll be interesting to see how geopolitical and geoeconomic structures shift and change. Thank you, Nancy. How should we as leaders benefit better the lessons that you've learned? You know what? Well, here's actually great. I forgot there's a slide that I didn't show. This is actually a book that I've been working on now for almost a year. It will come out in summer, and there's some friends of mine on the phone who I'm sure are cheering when I say that. But for me, it's not just about understanding these awakenings, but it's about building a mindset that allows us to build the future we want. If we really think a lot about where we're headed, this is not about taking 20th century even business thinking and applying it to the 21st century. I think a lot of the things that we assumed were really smart business practices are outliving their usefulness. The way we think about risk, I will argue that so many of the things that we put in place to mitigate risk are now the things that are creating the most vulnerability right now, like centralization, like assuming that the people who have, you know, the longest track record are the people with the most value to add to an argument or team, meaning like boards of directors. I think that we need to really think about how boards are structured. I think we need to think about hierarchy differently within our organization. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to shift and change in order to be able to use the insight of these awakenings and build a more thriving future for everyone. So that is, there's my son who's waking up at this hour. So I think that that's part of it. It's really about developing a capacity of what I call leadering versus leadership. Leadering is much more dynamic. It is much more inclusive. It is less hierarchical. It is constantly experimenting. It is not using a playbook. It is building a practice. It is not using a map. It's using a compass. So how do we get better at learning how to do that? And this moment's kind of throwing us into a moment where we realize how important it is to develop those capacities. Yeah, so there's a whole question around GDP versus well-being. Well-being is a portion of it, but well-being is an interesting number to try and wrap your arms around. So we're trying to actually find actual economic markers for being able to measure well-being and thrivability, but it includes a whole bunch of things. It includes our relationship with the environment, it includes our relationship, again, with unpaid work. There's a lot that goes into that, and we've been thinking about it. Rianne has been doing this work again for many years, and she has 14 economic indicators, social wealth economic indicators, that we're working with a team of technologists to roll into one index. And there are other people who are working on this kind of thing too, so we'll see where it goes. But it also is rooted in a very different way of thinking about economic structures. So she will argue that we are locked in this battle between capitalism and socialism, which are both based on a very dominant or dominance narrative, and that there's actually a different way of thinking about this called partnerism. And I know that sounds very on the edge, and it's work that we're still developing, and we're going to get that story out more clearly in the next few months. But if you follow my work, that's part of where I'm trying to head to, is that we just have a whole different way of thinking about this and looking about this so that we aren't applying old tools to new thinking. And I will argue again, if we take old thinking and apply it to all these really potent technologies that are coming down the pike, we will actually be in a pretty dangerous situation. It's better if we can think about this thing again, about being compassionate and empathetic and humanistic and collaborative in the deployment of the technologies that we will have at our disposal. Is there an involved governmental leadership metric voters can use? No, but the only thing I think that I don't have that answer, but I think what's actually interesting is to see how different governments around the world are thinking about this. Estonia, I think, is an interesting example about how they're bringing technology in and making it much more, I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, but for the most part, from what I've read, there's a lot in which they're trying to empower citizenry. And so it's not about the metrics so much, but it's around the tools and ways in which government can facilitate their role in different ways. So I think there's lots of ways to be able to look at. What do you think would be the jobs for people with low income that cannot work at home? Well, I think what we're actually seeing, that was Joshua brought this up before, what we're seeing is that so many people who are vital to our economy are people that we're now paying more respect to. There was a person who was a garbage collector who put something on Twitter, and man, he got so much love. And people were so grateful for him. So there are still vital roles and industries that will continue to be needed. Whether those get automated over time, even nursing will be augmented, robotics, and truck drivers will have a different role. And so the question will be, what will be that role as we move forward? And I don't have it fully sorted out. I don't know that we're going to be able to do that without some sort of universal basic or universally distributed support, is my belief. But again, I'm on that side of the table. There's a really close friend of mine in town named Byron Reese who would argue the exact opposite. So we're gonna have to make some decisions and decide, is it possible to prepare for multiple scenarios as we move into this future, and what gives us the better chance for success as we, what kind of future do you want? I mean, that's really what we describe in this book. Like, what kind of future do you want? And I want one in which everyone has an opportunity to thrive. Right? That we still have an opportunity to bring our creativity and to bring our entrepreneurial zeal and to build extraordinary solutions. I believe in all of those dynamics, but I think that there needs to be a level playing field that holds people well in that. Yes, Budon has one about well-being. I don't want to go too far into the whole social wealth thing, because I think that's a whole rabbit hole that we can go down. But yes, there are people who are creating well-being metrics. There's a well-being budget right now out of New Zealand. There's even communities like Santa Monica that are thinking a lot about it, but they're looking at it through a more, I don't know if it's a more narrow lens, but we're really trying to apply it to an economic, like this makes economic sense to do, right? We will actually thrive better economically if we look at things through a wider lens. We don't leave out portions of the population or our behaviors to certain parts of our environment that are degrading. Like, you could argue GDP has risen, but at the expense of many breakdowns that are both environmental and social. And so how do we balance that better? And there will be a range of work that's being done over this. And I think, again, being curious about them and being able to compare and contrast them until we figure out the one that really is probably the most viable is the work over the next few years. All those people who are interested in the GDP conversation, reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I would love to loop you into our community when we talk about this, because we've got a great group of people around the world that are thinking about this, and it's such early days. I guess I threw it out there because I want to give hope that we're thinking about a completely different way of being able to account for and create value. And I think that's a really important part. So that, again, the things that I am spending my time on is AI, because I really do think that's the technology that will fundamentally change everything about what we do. The distributed web, which is blockchain and post-blockchain. I'm working on something called Holochain. If you guys are interested in that, it's really about building a distributed system for exchange of value. And then thinking about the social wealth index as a new and more evolved measure for how we track our success for everyone. So those are kind of the three areas that I'm spending my time. Yeah, I agree. Happiness is a good thing. Thanks, Doc. Thinking about the paradigm of growth. Yeah, so degrowth is a really great question. I actually do believe in positive degrowth. I think it's entirely possible. And I think partly the reason that GDP will become outdated is because certainly the price of many things is going to drop, right? If I can 3D print a house, which I can do right now, there's a company in Austin called Icon that can 3D print a house for $7,000 in 24 hours. And there are people around the world that are doing it. It's another company in China called Winsun that's doing it. And suddenly the price of a house goes way down, right? The price of energy goes way down. If we're able to vertically grow food and be able to be so much more efficient in how we use resources to create and distribute things, then the question will be, can I live on on less? So degrowth isn't necessarily any way that it would change my quality of life, but the metrics around that might look really different if we build cooperatives. The sharing economy was a really interesting move in that direction and isn't included in GDP. So I think that there's just some really fascinating ways in which we can think about how the intersection between technological advance and societal recalibration allows us to think about these things through really different kinds of lens. And we don't necessarily have to adopt everything that has been structured thus far and assume that that's the way that it needs to go forward. We get to rebuild it. That's the thing that's most exciting to me about this moment, is that we get to rebuild the future, or the future is being built now, and it's being built by us. And I think the pandemic is giving us an opportunity to kind of rethink that, which is why I love the theme of this, the Great Pause. Such a geniusly themed event for this, because I think it is about an opportunity to pause and figure out what we want to build, and be really intentional and clear about that moving forward. Can we even agree on a common future now? No, I think that there are going to be people who have their various vested interests in this, but I think what was interesting to me, if you had asked me again years ago whether or not you'd have 181 CEOs sign a pledge in the United States saying that we would put stakeholders on the same par as shareholders, if not even higher, people and planet over profits, I would have thought that that was a long day coming. We've been advocating for that for 15 years, and here we are. So I think people are recognizing that there is a business imperative to take better care of each other and to take better care of the environment. That's where things are moving. So I find that to be actually really, really encouraging. And I think, again, for me, these pandemic awakenings just accelerate that and amplify that and make that more visible as to why that is the right thing to do. Heidi, hi. What is the most important thing individuals could do to contribute to societal recalibration in the future? I think, again, it's becoming really curious. One of the things we talk a lot about is being a place of wonder versus resistance. Again, what we're seeing, and that's why I put that first shift, is that we're en masse jumping into this. I, for years, have been advocating for this stuff and told that it was too difficult. Inertia was always the thing that kept people in place. And I have a neighbor now who's an architect, and for the first time did a design charrette for 5 hours with her team for a new school that they're designing, and was blown away by how successful it was. You never would have thought that that would have worked. We'd have never gotten 1.1 million kids in remote learning without this extraordinary experience. So I think that it's just about being open and being curious. It's about building networks of shared learning and support. It's thinking about collaboration in a really different way. It's about collaborating with your competitors. What we're seeing here in our own state is that the grocery store is selling restaurant food, and restaurants are selling groceries. I mean, I think it's just so interesting to see how things are blending. So just being much more open and less rigid in our thinking about what's possible. So I don't know where we are on time. Are we almost done? Do we have more? I'm going to talk about this stuff forever, but it is a real privilege to be with you guys. Thank you. Oh, Kelly, how can leaders balance everything I rightly said about the future and deal with short-term market expectations? All right, so this is always the question, right, about how do I deal with the current realities? And I think so much of this is framed right now through capital market expectations. So one of the big questions will be, right, is it really smart to be thinking about things from how do you balance short-term expectations with long-term investment and long-term balance? And I would argue that portion of the distortion is the way that capital markets have forced companies to think in such short windows, right? One of the things that we actually, a study that we reference in my book is that when CEOs were asked if they would be willing to make an investment that long-term would help the business, but short-term would hurt profitability, would they do it or not? And 80% of CEOs said no, they would not invest in a long-term solution because it would hurt short-term profitability. And that, I think, is just, and I don't think it's the CEO's fault. I think it's the way that they're incentivized, the way the system is built. So I think that there's a whole question around that. We have worked with CEOs actually who have and coached them to try and pull away from that. I don't know what you call it, but that sort of that cycle. You saw the Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, who declared that he was not going to be reporting quarterly earnings so that he would try and build a longer term investment portfolio or just be seen as a longer term investment, not so short term. So it's a really complicated question, but I think that right now you've got companies that are trying to survive and reinvent simultaneously. almost every company even before this that we talked to said that they were literally trying to put the wheels on the race car while we were racing it, or trying to build a plane while they were flying it, or trying to build a bridge while they were crossing it. We heard the same metaphor over and over again. And so the question is, how do we help build capacity so that as an organization, they're able to handle change? I think the best thing that can happen right now for leaders is to recognize that in this moment of upheaval, make the changes that you wanted to make. Don't let a good crisis go to waste, as Winston Churchill used to say, right? What are ways in which we can help people now that have already been dislocated make the decisions that will actually enhance the organization and their own resilience in it? So I think there's an empathy piece to this for sure, but I think there's also an encouraging people to take a bigger leap now that they've started to. Given the similar cyclical nature of politics, short-term outcomes to help re-election, yeah. All right, so that I go back to whole campaign finance reform. I'm not sure where this question is going. Do you think there's a way that we can translate this incentivization of future over the present? Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, campaign finance reform, I think, is one of the big corrupt influences. Again, when you've got lawmakers that have to, every time they barely get elected and have to go raise a bunch of money to go get elected again, it creates a lot of incentives to do the wrong thing as opposed to incentives to do the right thing. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what are the incentive structures that are in place for us, again, to hold each other well, and how do we try and address those? And those are, again, deeply entrenched things. I'm not saying that they're super easy, but you see candidates on the trail. I loved listening to Elizabeth Warren as she was describing what was possible. Even Trump, to some extent, would talk about some of the distortions in the system. And so I do think that we're going to hopefully see those more and try and dismantle them as we move forward, or try to figure out ways in which those lose their impact. What is it, globally or just in the US? It's the US gave this answer. I think that was just a US answer. I don't think that that was a global CEO answer. It was a study out of Duke. I can try and send you the link if you're interested, but it was just really disheartening to realize, again, that I know many CEOs who want to do the right thing, but are not in any way protected if they do the right thing, because there's expectations from the market based on their long-term success. That's actually an interesting thing, right? It's the companies that have legacy companies that have had a lot of success in the past and have been purchased as that kind of consistent player that have the hardest time making this shift. New folks can do it. Certainly entrepreneurial companies can do it that are taking investment, but ones that are legacy companies with a long track record of success have the hardest time shifting that expectation from their shareholders. Now, so this question is, do we think that the pandemic can do spotlight on rethinking society's short-term fad that may fade out again? Here's what I worry is going to happen. You're going to have two really polarizing experiences, and I don't know what percentage this is, and I certainly hope this one wins. One in which people really do wake up and recognize that something really significant is happening here, and that there's all these opportunities to address imbalances and build a society, again, that is more balanced, and both with the environment and with each other and with technology and humanity. Like, all those three things or four things need to be worked out in a way that I think can be really very successful, and we can all thrive. And that has been my point of view clearly. What's been interesting in the last couple of weeks is to hear that there's actually also this potential rise of something that becomes more authoritarian and more totalitarianism and fascist, in which people just out of fear run to something that they think would make them feel safe. And I do think that there will be people who will exploit that. I read an interesting article actually the other day about after the Spanish flu in 1918, the person, Adolf Zucker, who took over the film business and the theater exhibition business and knocked all the small players out, including a lot of women and Mexican-American, Chinese-American, and African-American filmmakers, were just completely caught up at the knees by this like kind of power grab. And I do think that that is a really big danger as we move into this. So I think we need to be aware of it and alert to it, and cut it off before it has the potential. And I think part of that is reducing fear. The whole thing is if people can feel optimistic about the future, empowered about the future, feel like they've got agency in the future, feel like they can count on each other in this future, we will build much more sustainable solutions and much more inclusive, again, thriving solutions. If people feel really isolated, dislocated, and afraid, then they will go to things that I think are not safe. And so how can we make people feel included and feel like they feel safe in this future? I guess there's one last question that just asked about storytelling. Here's the thing. I think that a positive narrative is 10 times more powerful than a negative narrative. I don't think scaring people into the future works. I think giving people and painting a future of what's possible does work, and particularly for youth. Anybody that's around teenagers right now, they need more than ever to hear that there's a positive future that's possible and that they have a potential to help build it.